Thank you for joining I Am Possible, which is India's first Future Tech Meets Sustainability podcast. And today I'm delighted and honored to have with me Mr. Sudeep George, who's the VP of Engineering at iMerit Technology. He has over 18 years of experience specializing in imaging sensors and computer vision. Sudeep has co-founded Tonbo Imaging, a company that focuses on advanced imaging and sensor systems to sense, understand, and control complex environments. Sudeep, it's a complete pleasure and honor to have you on the podcast. Really appreciate you taking time being part of the podcast. What is iMerit? What does it do?
So iMerit was founded in 2012 by Radha Basu. Radha is a serial entrepreneur. She's taken a couple of companies public. We are headquartered in the US. We've got multiple office locations across India. We are also expanding in Europe. We are about 5,500 people strong. We are continuously expanding. We've got Khosla Impact and the Dell Foundation as some of our investors. Now, at iMerit, we help provide data intelligence for AI. We do this by working with a broad spectrum of AI companies and help them in classifying and structuring their data that is used to train ML models. We also provide actionable data insights that are used for test case generation, anomaly testing, and edge case management. At iMerit, we have a very large and committed workforce, and this workforce consistently delivers at very high quality SLAs. And this is how we distinguish ourselves from our competition. We are a HIPAA and a SOC 2 compliant company, and we work in domains like autonomous vehicles, autonomous mobility, conversational AI, document AI, medical imaging, amongst others. In short, we work with our customers and help them in their ML DataOps journey.
Data is going to play such a huge role in the future of AI. And today, I think, we're producing so much data. I mean, I was on the net and I kind of figured out that every day we produce somewhere around 2.5 quintillion bytes of data. Now, most of this data is completely unstructured and it's also unlabeled. So would you like to kind of talk about the role of high quality data in deploying artificial intelligence successfully?
That's a great question. So AI is a great example of the garbage in, garbage out paradigm. So you train your models with bad data, you're going to get bad performance. And this becomes all the more critical when you work with a data-centric approach, which is a new paradigm for AI development. Now, it's very important to understand that there are two factors that influence the kind of data that is used within AI development. One of them being the amount of data. For most AI systems to be developed, we have to work with large amounts of data. You mentioned the data point, but on a daily basis, terabytes of data, if not more, are being processed within our own company. The second important aspect is that a lot of time is spent within the data process. So as part of ML training, you work on data and then you build your models and then you test your models. Nearly 60 to 70% of the time is just spent around data. So any bad quality data that comes in through any of these phases will impact the time that is taken for your models to be released into production. And we are talking about delays of nearly 50 to 60% of the original time estimates. This in turn leads to various financial losses. And in many cases, companies don't even make it to the market because their models just don't perform in the real world. Some of the significant areas of impact are when the model is deployed, you start seeing a degradation of performance. Now, unlike software development, in ML development, your models can be released, but you're going to get degraded performance. And that's how you know that things aren't working the way it should. To give you a very simple example, you release a face detection system and it's got bias, it doesn't handle ethnicities. Great and very simple examples to understand the impact of bad data on an AI system's performance.
You mentioned that garbage in, garbage out. I mean, we like I said, we creating so much data every day. Now, the way we humans function is, when the child grows up, he doesn't need a lot of information. He realizes, he perceives the world. I mean, in a very quick manner. I mean, do you see we coming to a point where we can come to create these machine learning tools which does not actually require so much data. There's something called as less than one shot or low shot learning that does not require a lot of data. Do you see that being the future?
It's definitely on the roadmap for the future. But what is very important to understand here is that you're trying to replicate a real world scenario. What is AI development? You have a model of the real world that you're trying to build, and then you deploy this model to make sure that it can function in the real world. So there are many ways in which you can approach it. One of the most significant methods that are being used across the landscape today is supervised learning. The methods that you mentioned are along the same path, but they head into the semi-supervised or unsupervised domain. Now, this is a great way for AI systems to be developed, but the jury's still out in terms of its accuracy and its performance in the real world. And that is where the end impact lies, right? Because you need to make sure that these systems can actually function in the real world. Many of the AI systems that we build don't really have a human safety impact. But imagine you build a self-driving car and it fails 2 times out of 100. Those two failure points can be life-threatening, right? So there is an impact, and that impact needs to be studied. Some of these methods are being used where the impact is minimized or can be contained, perhaps in terms of let's say some content moderation, or in terms of financial systems where they are only one part of the entire pipeline of the model. Different scenarios where some of these methods can be applied, but you really have to still have this arsenal of methods at this moment to build AI systems.
I mean, we've got so much data. Every day we are we're producing so much data. So how do you ensure that the data is of high quality, and where does one source this from?
So, like I mentioned, an AI development lifecycle is all about trying to build a model of the real world and then performing within that real world. So, it's very important that you build this model of the real world with data that truly replicates the environment in which you are operating. If you take self-driving cars, the term that is used is operational design domain. So, you design the model to work in a certain configuration, and it is designed to work very well in that configuration. But it's also important to make sure that you define this configuration correctly. So this is where collecting the right amount of data, the right kind of data becomes critical. Because if you don't collect data that covers all aspects of your working environment, then the model will obviously have gaps and will fail in deployment. Now, if you go into some of the deeper aspects of data that is used within training AI systems, it is also very important to pay a lot of attention to data collection. There are different ways in which data can be collected. And I'm going to take the example of self-driving cars because it's in the computer vision space, very easy for people to relate to. Now, if you're building a self-driving car system, it doesn't help if you take images of the road from a drone. You need to have a car on the road collecting data. So the point of collection becomes very important. The further away you are from the actual data within which you're going to operate, there's a lot more noise that comes in, and that can skew your results. Then comes the method of collecting data. There are different ways in which humans perceive the world, but there are also a lot of other technologies that can be used to get a deeper understanding. For example, again, in the self-driving space, you can work with images coming out of cameras, but you can also use LiDARs, radars, sonar in certain cases to get a better understanding of the environment. So collecting these different data modalities becomes very critical to ensuring that your model has a good chance of success once it's deployed. The third aspect is about how frequently do you collect? And that is something that is very much tied to the use case against which you're operating. If you are in the self-driving space, it doesn't help if you collect data today and then come back and refresh or update your data a year ahead, right? Because the real world is so dynamic and continuously changing that you would have lost a lot of information and your systems will not perform during this entire gap. So this is where the frequency of collecting data becomes really important. Apart from data collection, I think you also have to pay a lot of attention to data cleanup. Obviously, when you collect data from the real world, there's a lot of noise. Some of this noise is good for models to learn, but sometimes the noise can skew results, and that is where you need to make sure that there is cleanup done to remove outliers, to make sure that there are no underfitting or overfitting issues that occur in your model's performance.
Could you elaborate on your, you mentioned about the data collection, you've collected so much data, then you need to do this cleanup. How do you go about doing that? How do you go about annotating, labeling the data, and how does it help in your artificial intelligence performance? And maybe you can also share some examples.
Now, when customers come to companies like iMerit and they say that I want to annotate data, there are two distinct aspects that they are actually requiring. One is plain vanilla data classification and annotation to be performed, but also to make sure that this is at a very high quality. So it's data annotation plus data annotation quality that is critical to ensure that data is good enough for your models to be trained on. Now, when I look at data annotation by itself, it's very important that you be as accurate as possible in annotating your data. The reason why this becomes very important is if there are inaccuracies in how you annotate, those inaccuracies get reflected into your model's performance in the real world. To give you an example, let's say you have a person leaning against the car and the scene is annotated as a vehicle. Now, the model is trained and the system is deployed. And once deployed, it encounters a very similar situation. Now, when it encounters such a situation, since it has been trained to recognize this particular complex data scene as a vehicle, it will have a different set of rules. But imagine if you went back to the data annotation stage and you classified it as a vehicle and a person, and you trained the model accordingly. Immediately when the model is released and encounters a similar scene, the model understands that there is a human involved. So now safety becomes the paradigm, right? So all the decision making is around ensuring the safety of the human. So this is a great example of where accuracy of data annotation matters. Another example or another point that needs to be emphasized on is the attributes of the data that you annotate. Now, when I annotate a vehicle or a car as a vehicle, then I also will want to annotate it or add attributes that suggest whether this vehicle is moving or stationary. This becomes very important because, again, when the model is deployed and it sees a vehicle and it understands that this vehicle is moving, it enforces a different set of rules and performance optimizations to make sure that it can handle a moving vehicle as opposed to a stationary vehicle. So not only annotating data, but also specifying the attributes of the data points becomes very critical. And then comes the quality part, where typically in most companies, there is a consensus-driven mechanism where 2 or 3 people will be involved in the quality process of making sure that the particular object which is classified as a vehicle is truly a vehicle and it has no people leaning against it or some other element which could skew the results. At iMerit, we also use a lot of ML to help in the quality process. We use ML models that could potentially help in understanding if there are any flaws in the data that is annotated. And as soon as that is identified, we give this data back to the team and they re-annotate it and send it back for quality inspection.
Can you simplify or explain what machine learning data ops is and how does it help in deploying AI more efficiently?
ML DataOps is the processing and management of data that is used for various stages of ML development and various stages of ML production. And ML DataOps has to perform at scale because in today's AI systems, we typically work with huge quantities of data. Now, ML DataOps is all the more significant in today's landscape because the paradigm for building ML systems has changed from a model-centric approach to a data-centric approach. In the traditional model-centric approach, a model would be trained and built to a certain performance. And once that performance threshold was reached, the model would be continuously updated and tuned to get incremental improvements in performance. But once deployed, many of these models didn't perform very well in the real world. And that is where this other approach of building a model, bringing it to a certain performance threshold, and then training the model on different data sets was started. And with this approach, which is called a data centric approach to ML development, we are now seeing a tremendous improvement in the performance of these models once deployed. So this is slowly becoming a paradigm for ML development. And with a data-driven approach, there is a need for managing data at various stages. So you have ML DataOps in the data identification, data labeling, data cleanup stages. You also use ML DataOps to help manage this data. You can curate the data that you're working with the help of various tools and processes that come as part of the ML DataOps package. You can also reuse this quality data, this data that has passed all these checks and verifications for various ML training methods by sharing this data in a very secure manner across different teams. So you have tools and processes that help in this stage as well. ML DataOps also plays a very important role in training and in testing models, because with the help of ML DataOps, you create various data sets against which the model is tested and the performance is validated. This is also a point where synthetic data is brought in, because typically many of the edge cases that models encounter cannot be caught with regular data, and that is where you use synthetic data to help replicate some of these scenarios and validate the model performance in these scenarios. Post testing, you also use data ops in the monitoring of these models. So once a model is deployed, it immediately starts to depreciate. It runs into something called as training serving skew, which is that the model was trained on a certain set of data, but perhaps the data that it is actually seeing has changed. A great example could be models which were trained for face detection, but once COVID came in, people were wearing masks, and so the kind of data that the models had to work with changed. So in the monitoring stage, ML data ops is used to check the performance of the models with various data points. And once this model performance goes below a certain threshold, it is immediately sent back to the training stage. And that is where ML ops and ML data ops work hand in hand to make sure that there is a continuous feedback loop.
Right. So you mentioned that iMerit Technologies collects a lot of data. You clean it up. You do the labeling, annotation. You also mentioned the use case of autonomous vehicles. Could you share other use cases, where or companies which has leveraged your data, for other use cases? And maybe you could also talk about the other iMerit products that you have.
At iMerit, we essentially provide full service end-to-end capabilities. In order to understand this better, it is important to understand the landscape in the AI training world. So typically when companies get started, they use in-house tools or even certain proprietary tools to build and train their ML models. But they very soon run into this problem of having a lot of data. And that is when they start working with various workforce providers who provide trained talent who can be taught to work on a certain workflow, and they can be used to annotate this data. But soon, most of these companies hit another roadblock, that the quality begins to suffer. And that is exactly the kind of service that iMerit provides, where we not only provide the tools and the technology, we also provide trained personnel as well as various techniques to make sure that your quality of the training data is at its highest level possible. So at iMerit, we have a three-pronged approach to providing our end-to-end solutions. It's technology, talent, and technique. Under technology, we provide a lot of tools and processes that we use to annotate data, to clean the data, to make sure that the data meets the required quality metrics. To give you examples of other use cases, we work in the autonomous mobility space, where we are working with objects that are essentially pinpricks, right? So you have to make sure that you are able to distinguish these objects against the background, and you use various tools, you use computer vision, you use a lot of ML processing to make sure that you're able to handle these kind of images. It's also important to understand that at iMerit, we work with this broad spectrum of companies. So we work with different use cases, and we have tools that are meant for various data modalities. It could be tools that we have created for computer vision. It could be tools that we use for audio, for NLP. So we work with this gamut of tools and various processes and provide various technology components to our customers. We also provide a very specialized and trained workforce to help process this data. So this workforce not only understands the domain, it also understands the data. The way an image is perceived in the medical imaging space is very different from how it would be perceived in the self-driving space. And this talented team comes in to understand what are the modalities of data that you're working with, what is the domain within which you're going to use this data, and accordingly start classifying this data. We also provide various techniques that help many of our enterprise customers. We can dynamically scale up. So a customer comes in and says, hey, you were working on 500,000 data points, and tomorrow you have to work with 3 million data points, right? We can scale up in a matter of days. In order to scale this up, we obviously have a lot of backend tools and processes that enable dynamic scaling. We are also able to ensure that our workforce is trained very rapidly. We have, for all practical purposes, a small edtech company within our own organization that enables this. We also help our customers in understanding their data better by providing edge case management tools. Edge cases are actually very interesting because they form a fundamental roadblock for many of the AI systems from being deployed. And by having a trained workforce, being able to process these edge cases, to identify these edge cases, becomes very important and critical in accelerating this process. So these are some of the ways in which we provide, an end-to-end service, and we work with various customers. So we're working with customers in the fintech space. We're working with customers in conversational AI, document AI. So we have teams that understand how to classify named entity relationships, named entity linkages, various aspects of NLP. In case of audio, it's about dialect, transcription, various aspects that come into play for each of these domains.
What are some of the things that companies should keep in mind when they accelerate their AI development and deployment?
So, in terms of accelerating AI deployment, I think companies have to fundamentally understand that there is a huge world of difference between the MVP stage and the deployment stage, and they need to make sure that the tools and the processes that are required to help them scale up are built into the system at the earliest possible. I'm not recommending that they invest in ML ops and ML DataOps tools on day one, but planning to invest in that becomes very important because that affects the way you develop your ML code, the way you build your CI/CD environments. All of them have to factor in these aspects of potential ML ops and ML data ops processes in the future. I think another aspect that many companies have to focus on is on continuous training. The ball gets started once you deploy the models, and immediately you need to start having mechanisms where you can measure the performance of the models, because the real world is changing very dynamically, and it is important that you're always gauging and measuring the performance of your models. And as soon as you see a dip in the performance, you have a very tight feedback loop that can help you retrain that particular model. And that is where working with companies like iMerit give you access to the tools and processes that enable this. The third very important aspect, in my opinion, is the edge case management. Edge cases end up being the showstoppers for many AI deployments. It is very important that you have tools and processes that not only help you quickly resolve edge cases that are occurring right now with either your data or your model performance, but also to extract intelligence from your existing data to minimize the occurrence of these edge cases in the future. And that is where iMerit's edge case platform can come in to help you. We can give you actionable intelligence that can help you minimize your edge cases. We can give you the tools and the processes that help you resolve your edge cases as fast as possible.
You mentioned about data collection, data annotation, stuff like that. Talk about the real world use cases. Obviously, you mentioned about these so many clients who's been leveraging this. What's been the impact on machine learning and artificial intelligence? Maybe you can possibly take one specific sector. Maybe you could talk about fintech or healthcare. How is it impacting those enterprise right now, and where do you see this going in the next few years? Because data is the new oil, and we are moving on from the humans in the loop is changing, because earlier there were humans who were taking decisions, but because the data is the new oil, the data is taking the decisions more, and there are talks that maybe in the next few years possibly CEOs might get redundant. So start talking about the real world impact. Where do you think these machine learning, artificial intelligence is going to create impact, and possibly paint a picture of how it's going to look like in the next possible decade or so?
First of all, you mentioned data being the new oil, and companies like iMerit are the filters for this oil, right? We help in funneling data that comes from various sources and make sure that it has its required and desired impact on the AI system that is being built. Now, you kind of asked a very broad spectrum question, so I'm going to touch on certain aspects. You talked about whether it would make people redundant, and I don't think so. The current state of the art in ML is nowhere close to AGI, which is artificial general intelligence, and there's still a long way to go ahead. We see this very closely within iMerit, where we use a lot of ML to do annotation, but even today, the state of the art can only handle the simpler cases. Wherever there is a complex scenario, a human has to be brought in because they understand the context the best. So I don't see ML or AI replacing humans for a very long time. We have a long way to go. It is going to help accelerate the work that humans do, right? We're not going to spend time on mundane tasks. We're going to be focusing more on these specialized, complex tasks where we can bring our human intelligence to the fore. So that's my perception on the general state of human redundancy in AI systems. In terms of how are other companies using ML AI, there are different aspects to this. Most companies use this to model the real world, and with the help of this model, they try to understand some hidden interconnections between data, which help them in handling certain scenarios better. Like, for example, in fintech, most of the ML and AI development is all about trying to understand how the various patterns of data coexist, and to make some sense out of these patterns to deliver a certain piece of information to a stakeholder. That's what fintech is all about. At least AI in fintech is all about. If you talk about medical imaging, it's about how AI can help reach the customers in the patients in remote areas, as well as make sure that there is first level diagnosis that is done on a mass scale as compared to today. For example, in India today, there is one radiologist for, I think, every 1 lakh people, right? And that is obviously extremely problematic, given that radiologists are pretty busy, and there are a lot of cases that come their way. You could use AI, you could use medical imaging based AI to help do the first level diagnosis, so that some of the simpler cases can be diagnosed, or the practitioner, the radiologist, can get alerts or some basic level information about a patient before they even actually spend time with them. So this helps them in handling more cases, in reaching to remote areas. For example, there was this great movement a couple of years back. It still continues, where people were using mobile phones to check for eye diseases, and they were capturing this data. They were doing some pre-processing at their end, and then sending it to a doctor, to a qualified medical professional, who would then decide the next course of action. So these are ways in which AI is being leveraged to benefit the human population. So I look at it more as a partner than a competitor. It's going to help us live a better life. And of course, there has to be various safeguards. With every technology comes the potential for misuse. So you have to be really clear about what you want that specific AI system to do, and also make sure it is, security and control play a very important part of leveraging that AI technology.
We need to treat technology as a partner rather than a competitor, because whenever I have these conversations, the natural perception of anyone who's not into the tech is like, oh, AI is going to create automation, it's going to leave humans make them redundant and so on and so forth. But I think for humans, for throughout our human history, I think technology is a tool which is augmented us. It has helped us to create better businesses, right from the fires. But it is obviously it's not the technology which is bad, it's the humans who choose to use it in a certain way is the reason where technology could get bad, because technology inherently is not bad. It's how it can be leveraged for a bad use is the problem. So yes, technology is growing exponentially, and you mentioned that yes, we do not need to worry now, but I really feel that we need to have a larger conversation with everyone involved, the stakeholders, because technology is really growing exponentially. GPT-3 and NLP, it's trained on 175 billion parameters. Then OPT-3, Facebook. Then BERTA. There's some crazy things which is happening. And then the OpenAI CTO was mentioning that that these neural networks could be a little bit conscious. I think we need to pay heed of these really front movers of AI technology, because the way it's growing, if it's not kind of shaped of artificial intelligence, how do we get into that? It is like a no code, a possible tool towards getting over there, because there are a lot of enterprise who have an aversion towards AI, and we still have artificial intelligence. It's good in the research mode, but when it comes to implementation, it's still slow. How do we get to a democratization of AI where we make it accessible for everyone, where even small medium enterprises can leverage and benefit AI?
That's a great question. Personally, I think there are two significant aspects that need to be considered here. One is explainable AI. It is very important to understand what is happening under the hood. For a long time, AI and ML development was treated more as an art form, where there would be a few practitioners, and even they really didn't know each and every aspect of how it worked, but they would make sure that it gave the kind of output that was desired. Now there's this entire focus on explainable AI, the various tools, various processes. There's a fundamental thought process behind making sure that we can understand what's happening when we talk about neural networks, how it is inferring a certain scene, if it is a computer vision based domain, how it infers a particular scene, how it classifies a certain object, how it takes a certain decision. All of these are, I think, very critical to understanding how does an AI system operate. You can only have full control over something if you really understand every aspect of its performance, of its operation. And that is where explainable AI comes into play. The second aspect that is gaining a lot of traction, and rightly so, is ethical AI. So inherently, the world is full of bias, right? There is no denying that, there is no escaping that. But recognizing that and making sure that these AI systems can be trained ground up to make sure that bias is eliminated as much as possible. I still don't say that bias can be completely removed. It can be minimized, but inherently there would still be these certain scenarios where bias could come into play. But minimizing them would be a great way to ensuring that the technology works well for everyone. It doesn't help if technology favors a few. For technology to really have the kind of impact that we think of and we kind of hope for in a utopian world, it really needs to play fair. It needs to work the same for everyone. And I think these are two very important initiatives that are again coming under the gamut of ML ops, ML data ops. These are, there are tools, there are processes that are being developed behind it. There are a lot of smart people, extremely talented people working on these problem statements. So I think these are some of the ways in which the industry and the technology teams are realizing and working towards minimizing. I know artists who buy embedded hardware boards or off the shelf, build great, wonderful systems around it, and deploy it in ways that an engineer would never think. So I think no code AI broadens the reach of the technology. It allows it to penetrate domains where engineers necessarily don't play, right? So I think that's a great aspect of a no-code AI, but there's still a long way to go, and efforts are being made in the right direction, and hopefully it achieves its goal.
So you've been the program lead for the imaging platform that formed the basis of the first generation DARPA Mantis program. And you're also the co-founder at Tonbo Imaging, which is serving the military and defense sector. So how is AI being leveraged for defense? And does the militarization of artificial intelligence, autonomous drones worry you?
As with every technology, there has to be safeguards, but there are multiple ways in which that you can look at that problem statement, right? One is AI can help you reduce potential loss of life. It can help you achieve your end goals faster with minimal impact. But there's also the flip side where it can be misused, right? So we have always focused on building systems that help people make decisions. We don't make the end decisions. I think that problem that, or the scenario that you are talking about becomes very critical when the system is making a decision. But if it enables a human to take a decision, then it basically helps them. It accelerates the process of achieving an end goal. But at the end of the day, the human in the loop is extremely important. I strongly believe that in any system, there has to be a series of checks. You can use AI to understand the world better, but at the end of the day, the decision has to be in the hands of a human, and that's how things are working even today. Nobody is building a Terminator kind of robot and just letting it free. That's for sure.
Right, completely. I think Hollywood scared everyone, when it comes to artificial intelligence. So, could you share your viewpoints on, the cutting edge of artificial intelligence or innovators that's caught your attention? And in your view, how do you think artificial intelligence is gonna, socially impact India?
Great question. I think the biggest or the most important way in which AI can help us from an Indian context is in ensuring that technology reaches the right people, right? Like I talked about AI being used to discover those hidden patterns. And with the help, when working with a population the size of India, you really need a lot of serious number crunching to be done to understand, various ways in which things can be achieved. And that's where AI comes into play. A great example could be in understanding or using tools that are AI based for understanding diseases. You could use, given the kind of data that is collected for many of the medical imaging projects, you could use AI to understand, to make a first level diagnosis, and that makes a lot of impact in a country like India, where we always have a shortage of trained medical professionals. So that is one aspect. I also feel that it can help us as a country relate to each other better, because with AI is where you have these multilingual chatbots, where you have Google Translate kind like tools coming into play, and it's awesome, right? I mean, you could today go to any place of India and you could at least have a very basic conversation with them. And of course, my favorite use case for machine learning is Google Maps in India. It's a great example of how a piece of technology has fundamentally changed the landscape, right? You're no longer rolling down your car windows and asking somebody for directions. You're just heading to your direction. And given India's network of roads, that's like, blessing in disguise.
Right. We could just spend a day on how technology has completely upended our life, and it's touched almost all sectors, be it healthcare, education, training, entertainment, and I think in the next few years, the products and application, that's going to open up. It's going to, take us into the future where our life is going to get much better, for those students and entrepreneurs who would want to get into machine learning on AI. What would you advise or suggest to them? Where can they start from, and is iMerit hiring at this point in time?
Absolutely, very close to my heart. We are hiring. We are scaling up our teams. We work in multiple areas. We work in web application development. We work on databases. We work on data engineering, as well as ML as well. ML in all its forms. So we are hiring for ML engineers in computer vision, NLP, audio space. We're hiring ML ops engineers. We are hiring data science professionals, full stack developers, UI, UX, front end, back end, database. The entire gamut of trained professionals that are needed to build web application based products, as well as to build ML systems that are used, at least in iMerit's case, ML is used to train ML. So building all of these systems is, the challenge, and that is where we are hiring. And at iMerit, another important aspect to consider is the fact that we work with a lot of high growth companies. We're working with the top 3 or top 4 self-driving car companies in the world. So you're getting exposure to a lot of the cutting edge technologies. We're working with autonomous drone companies, medical imaging companies. So you get this exposure to these cutting edge technologies. And we ourselves are a high growth company. So you're coming into a secure, stable environment. You're getting a chance to work with these cutting edge technologies and build a career for yourself. So at any point, if your audience wants to understand more, please visit imerit.com/career. You could also send an email to technologyhiring@imerit.net, and we're more than happy to have a chat.
Paint a picture of what the world is going to look like in the next 10 years. When do we get these autonomous vehicles? When does a doctor's life gets much simplifier? And when do we get into a precision medicine world? And this Web 3.0 metaverse, there's some exciting things happening. So maybe possibly paint a picture of your trends, predictions, and the role of iMerit and Sudeep George.
So the biggest danger of predicting in the AI ML space is you're guaranteed to be wrong. So I'm not going to speculate too much on dates, but I do think self-driving cars are slowly becoming a reality, though perhaps not the way it was originally visualized. Here we are now looking at these autonomous vehicles operating in environments like highways, where things are a bit more contained. In last mile delivery, autonomous drones are being used for that. So I'm seeing a lot of these companies in various stages of active deployment. So I think over the next couple of years, you will see many of these systems in active production. And you're already seeing this today with Cruise and a bunch of other self-driving car companies like Waymo, who have these pilot programs running in various cities. There's always this question of when it's going to come to India, and I would not choose to speculate on that at this point. But it's coming in some form or the other. This technology would be beneficial for us in different ways, right? So that's about the autonomous space. In terms of medical imaging, I'm seeing a fundamental shift in how companies are approaching ML and AI that is used for medical imaging use cases. It is still a chaotic world because unlike autonomous vehicles, it is just getting started. Investments are just rolling in. There's a lot of trial and error that is needed, and that's exactly the phase that many of these companies are going through. But I do see that over perhaps the next 5 to 10 years, there's going to be fundamental differences in how technology plays a role in the medical world. The last domain that I'd like to comment on is the AR, VR, MR space. I think it's going to be a radical change. It's going to fundamentally change the way we experience our world, the way we interact with our world, and also with fellow human beings. All of these are going to undergo fundamental changes. There's a lot of great ideas floating around. Some of them are slowly coming into execution mode. Obviously, it's also an area where there are a lot of technological challenges. These are not easy problems to solve. A lot of the smartest folks at some of the biggest companies you can think of are working on solving these problems. So there's definitely enough attention being paid here. But I think that is definitely an exciting space that's going to go live in the next few years.
Thank you for taking time and being part of the podcast. Yes, there's some really exciting movements, and it's not just abroad. I think in India there's some really cool things happening. There's some awesome autonomous vehicle startups who are looking at level 5 autonomous vehicle, and they're doing some really cool things in the AR, VR, MR space, the metaverse, which is opening up. I think there are some great startups over here. I think we need to create a more collaborative ecosystem where all the stakeholders comes together and enables and empowers and nurtures and nudges the startup and the innovator ecosystem to create a world where we start seeing real world values of these tools, because like you mentioned, it's going to touch every possible industries, so I'm excited for the space, and that's the reason I have this conversation, and the intention is to simplify it so more people understand that these are not like really far away. They are right here, and it's just it's there, and you guys are at the forefront of taking that data and making it accessible for everyone. So wish you and the team the very best. And to my listeners, if you like what you see in here, then please press the subscribe button. Until next time, see you guys. Bye bye. Thank you.
Thank you, Eddie.